Nobody warns you when the tide turns. It does not announce itself. There is no single dramatic moment where the music changes and the lighting shifts and everyone in the room understands simultaneously that something fundamental has just reversed direction. The tide simply goes out quietly, gradually, and then one morning you look down and realize the ground beneath your feet is no longer what it was. That is what is happening to Donald Trump's Iran blockade right now. Not a collapse, not a rebellion, not a dramatic confrontation in a televised summit room, just a quiet, steady, accelerating withdrawal of the global political support that any military operation of this scale and consequence requires to remain sustainable. And the White House, for all its confidence and all its rhetoric, does not yet appear to fully grasp the speed at which that support is disappearing. The Iran blockade was sold to the world as a demonstration of American resolve, a signal to Tehran, to Beijing, to every government watching that the United States under Donald Trump does not negotiate from weakness, does not tolerate defiance, and does not make threats it is unwilling to enforce with the full weight of American military power. The message was supposed to be received with a mixture of fear and respect. What it is actually being received with in capital after capital across Europe, across Asia, across the Gulf, across the developing world is something closer to alarm. Not alarm at Iran, alarm at Washington. And the distinction between those two things is the entire story of where this blockade goes from here. Tonight, we are going to do what the Sunday morning television panels and the establishment foreign policy journals have not yet managed to do. We are going to look honestly at the global political landscape around Trump's Iran blockade and tell you what it actually shows. We are going to explain why the opposition forming against this blockade is not the usual chorus of anti-American voices that Washington can safely dismiss. We are going to map the specific countries, the specific economic pressures, and the specific diplomatic signals that together constitute a warning that the Trump administration is either not hearing or not taking seriously enough. We are going to examine what happens to American strategic credibility in a world where its closest allies are publicly uncomfortable with its most consequential military decision. And we are going to answer the question that the situation now demands an honest answer to. Is Donald Trump's Iran blockade making America stronger, or is it making America lonelier at precisely the moment when loneliness is the most dangerous thing a superpower can afford to be? Subscribe right now. Share this immediately. The analysis that follows is the one the moment requires, not the one that is comfortable to deliver. Here is the architecture of tonight's analysis. First, we examine the nature of the opposition forming against the blockade, because understanding who is pushing back and why is the only way to understand how serious the problem actually is. Second, we look at what the economic damage pattern of the blockade is doing to the political calculations of governments that are nominally aligned with the United States, but are now facing pressures their domestic politics cannot absorb quietly. Third, we go deep into the diplomatic signals that have been sent from European capitals in recent weeks, because Europe's discomfort with this blockade is not a minor complication. It is a structural problem for the entire American strategic position. Fourth, we examine the role that global institutions and international legal frameworks are playing in the growing narrative against the blockade, and why the legal argument is becoming a political weapon that opponents are learning to use with increasing effectiveness. Fifth, we map where this situation goes from here, with the three honest trajectories that the evidence actually supports, not the ones that are politically convenient to believe in. Let us begin with who is actually pushing back, because this is the fact that the Trump administration's public posture has consistently failed to reckon with honestly. When America's adversaries oppose an American military operation, that opposition is expected, manageable, and politically useful. When Russia condemns an American action, Washington points to the condemnation as evidence that the action is working. When Iran's allies in the region issue statements of outrage, those statements are absorbed into the existing narrative and do not materially change anything. Adversary opposition is the background noise of American foreign policy. It has been for decades. No administration, Republican or Democrat, loses sleep over it. But that is not primarily what is happening around Trump's Iran blockade. What is happening is something qualitatively different and considerably more consequential. The opposition forming around this blockade is coming from friends. It is coming from partners. It is coming from governments that sit in NATO councils, that host American military bases, that have signed security agreements with Washington, that have aligned their own foreign policies with American leadership for generations. And that category of opposition is not background noise. That category of opposition is a 5-alarm warning that something has gone wrong at the foundational level of American strategic relationships. Start with Japan. Japan is perhaps the most security-dependent American ally on Earth. It hosts American military forces on its soil. Its entire defense architecture is built around the American security guarantee. Its political class has spent 7 decades carefully managing the relationship with Washington to ensure that the guarantee remains credible and the alliance remains strong. Japan does not pick fights with American presidents. It does not publicly break with American policy. It works through private channels, through quiet diplomacy, through the kind of careful behind-the-scenes communication that maintains the appearance of alliance unity while conveying the reality of Japanese concerns. And right now, through every private channel available to it, Japan is conveying to Washington that the Iran blockade is creating economic conditions that the Japanese government cannot sustain without domestic political consequences that threaten the stability of the government itself. Japan imports an enormous share of its energy through the Strait of Hormuz. When that waterway is disrupted by an American military operation, Japanese energy prices rise, Japanese manufacturing costs rise, Japanese consumers pay more for heating, more for transportation, more for every product whose production or delivery depends on affordable energy. And Japanese voters who did not choose this conflict and have no particular stake in its outcome ask their government why they are being made to pay for an American decision they were not consulted about. That question, asked loudly enough and consistently enough across a Democratic electorate, becomes a political crisis. And a political crisis in Tokyo over the cost of an American military operation in the Persian Gulf is not a small problem for Washington. It is the beginning of the unraveling of the political coalition that makes American power in Asia coherent and credible. South Korea is in an almost identical position. Heavily dependent on Gulf energy, deeply reliant on the American security architecture for its own national survival, and now facing the uncomfortable reality that the country guaranteeing its security is also the country whose military decisions are raising its energy costs and generating economic instability it did not invite and cannot easily escape. South Korean officials speak carefully in public. They will not directly criticize the Trump administration's decision to impose the blockade. The relationship is too important and the security dependence too real for that kind of open confrontation. But in the diplomatic language that governments use when they need to communicate discomfort without triggering a crisis, Seoul is being very clear that the current situation is not one it can endorse indefinitely, and that it needs the situation to change in ways that reduce the economic burden being imposed on its citizens by a conflict they are not party to. India presents an even more complex picture. India is not a treaty ally of the United States in the formal sense that Japan and South Korea are. But Washington has invested enormous political and diplomatic capital in recent years in building a stronger strategic partnership with New Delhi, explicitly framed as a counterweight to growing Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. India and the United States have been moving closer on defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, and technology transfer in ways that both governments have described as a historic realignment. And now, at a critical moment in that relationship-building process, the Trump administration has imposed a blockade that directly damages the Indian economy, raises energy costs for hundreds of millions of Indian citizens, and creates political pressure on the Indian government to publicly distance itself from American policy. The timing could not be worse. The message it sends about what the strategic partnership with America actually means in practice could not be more counterproductive. India is watching, calculating, and quietly reminding itself that economic relationships and strategic partnerships that come with unpredictable and costly side effects require careful hedging. This is the reality of the opposition forming around Trump's Iran blockade. It is not the opposition of enemies celebrating American overreach. It is the opposition of partners calculating the cost of American decisions they did not shape and cannot afford. And partners who are calculating costs are partners who are also calculating alternatives. That calculation is the beginning of strategic drift. And strategic drift, once it begins, is remarkably difficult to reverse. Now let us go into the economics with the depth they require, because the economic architecture of this situation is where the pressure on the Trump administration is most real and most immediate. The American decision to impose the blockade was made from a position of genuine domestic energy security. The United States produces enough of its own oil to be largely insulated from Persian Gulf supply disruptions. American drivers, American factories, American heating systems are not going to experience the blockade as a sharp shock to their daily lives in the way that citizens in energy importing nations will. This is true and it matters, but it matters in a way that creates a dangerous blind spot in American strategic planning, because the insulation that protects American consumers from the economic pain of the blockade also insulates American policymakers from the political feedback that pain generates. Washington is not feeling what Tokyo is feeling, what Seoul is feeling, what New Delhi is feeling, what Brussels is feeling. And because it is not feeling it, it is systematically underestimating how much pressure those feelings are generating in the governments of countries that matter enormously to the sustainability of American global strategy. The energy price spikes hitting ally economies are not abstract statistical events. They translate into specific human experiences that generate specific political pressures. A Japanese household paying significantly more to heat its home through winter is a household whose members are talking to each other about why this is happening and who is responsible. A South Korean manufacturer facing higher energy input costs is a business leader who is talking to politicians about the economic environment those politicians are responsible for maintaining. An Indian family watching fuel prices rise is a family whose vote is attached to expectations about economic stability that rising fuel prices undermine. Multiply these individual experiences across tens of millions of households and businesses in multiple allied nations, and you have an enormous aggregate political force pushing governments in a specific direction toward demanding that the situation change, toward finding diplomatic language that creates distance from American policy, toward quietly exploring what alternative arrangements might look like. China understands this dynamic with precision. Beijing did not create it. The Trump administration created it by imposing a blockade whose economic costs fall primarily on American allies rather than on America itself. But China has recognized the dynamic for exactly what it is, which is an enormous political opportunity, and it is exploiting that opportunity with the kind of patient, sophisticated, multi-layered diplomacy that has become a signature of Chinese foreign policy engagement in the current era. Beijing is offering itself to energy importing nations as the voice of their interests in a world where the country that controls the waterway their energy moves through is also the country imposing the disruption. That positioning is not universally accepted. It is not without its own contradictions, but it is landing with enough resonance in enough capitals to significantly complicate the American political position around the blockade in ways that the Trump administration has not yet found an effective response to. The European dimension of this crisis is the one that deserves the most careful attention, because Europe's discomfort with the Iran blockade is operating on a different register than the discomfort of Asian allies, and it is creating different kinds of problems for Washington. European governments are not primarily worried about the economic costs of the blockade in the way that Japan and South Korea are, though those costs are real and present in European calculations. European governments are worried about something deeper and more structural. They are worried about what the blockade represents as a model of how the United States intends to exercise its power in the world going forward. The Trump administration's willingness to impose a blockade on one of the world's most critical maritime choke points unilaterally, without NATO consultation, without UN authorization, without the kind of coalition building and legitimacy construction that previous American administrations treated as essential preconditions for major military action, reads to European governments not as an isolated decision about Iran, but as a declaration of intent about how America understands its own authority in the international system. That declaration is genuinely alarming to European political establishments across the ideological spectrum. Conservative governments in Europe that have been strong defenders of the Atlantic Alliance are struggling to explain to their own publics and their own parties why the alliance requires them to support or at minimum not publicly oppose an American action that violates the international legal principles their countries have built their post-war foreign policy identities around. Progressive governments in Europe that have been arguing for a stronger multilateral approach to global security are facing the uncomfortable reality that the alliance with America they support requires them to accommodate an American administration that has contempt for the multilateral framework they value. Neither conservative nor progressive European governments have a comfortable position on the Trump-Iran blockade. And governments without a comfortable position tend to find ways to signal their discomfort that have consequences for the alliance relationships they are nominally committed to maintaining. The signals coming from European capitals right now, through speeches at international forums, through voting patterns in multilateral institutions, through the diplomatic language chosen for bilateral communiques with Washington, through the decisions about which American requests for logistical and intelligence cooperation receive enthusiastic responses and which receive cautious delays, amount to a collective communication from Europe to the Trump administration. The communication is politely worded. It is wrapped in expressions of alliance solidarity and shared values, but its core message is unmistakable to anyone who reads diplomatic signals with any seriousness. Europe is not with you on this one. Europe is managing its distance carefully because the consequences of open rupture are too serious to contemplate, but Europe is not with you. And an America that is not with Europe on its own terms and not with Europe on American terms is an America whose claim to lead a Western alliance is becoming increasingly formal and decreasingly operational. The international legal dimension of the opposition to the blockade is the element that the Trump administration seems most inclined to dismiss, and that is most likely to prove the most durable source of damage to American strategic interests. The legal argument against the blockade, that it violates international maritime law, that it constitutes an act of war under established definitions of naval blockade, that it exceeds any authorization that UN Security Council resolutions have provided, is not a knockout blow in any immediate practical sense. The United States is not going to be hauled before an international tribunal and forced to lift the blockade by a legal ruling. American military power operates in the real world, not in the world of international legal theory. Trump and his advisors know this and have made clear they consider the legal objections largely irrelevant to their decision-making. But here is what the legal argument actually does that the Trump administration's dismissal of it completely misses. It provides political cover. It provides every government that wants to create distance from American policy with a respectable, principled, internationally legitimate reason for doing so that does not require that government to characterize itself as anti-American or pro-Iranian. A government that says we oppose this blockade because we oppose Iranian missile development is making a political choice that has costs and consequences. A government that says we have concerns about the consistency of this blockade with international maritime law is making a legal observation that is difficult to argue with and that allows the government to position itself as a defender of rules and norms rather than as a critic of American power. The legal framing transforms opposition from a political act into a principled stand. And principled stands are considerably easier to sustain domestically, considerably harder for Washington to pressure against, and considerably more effective at building the coalition of voices that constitutes meaningful international opposition. China has understood and exploited this dynamic brilliantly by consistently framing its own position on the blockade in international legal language, by calling for adherence to UN Charter principles and international maritime law, by positioning itself as a defender of the rules-based order against American unilateralism. Beijing has given itself and every government that chooses to align with its position a vocabulary that is simultaneously critical of American policy and immune to the charge of being anti-Western or destabilizing. It is a masterclass in how to build an international coalition without formally announcing that you are building one. Where does this all lead? 3 trajectories exist, and honesty requires examining all 3 without selecting the one that is most comfortable. The first trajectory is that the Trump administration holds the blockade in place and absorbs the political cost. American naval power maintains physical control of the strait. Allied discomfort is managed through private diplomacy and public reassurances that the operation is temporary, targeted, and serving the broader collective interest in preventing Iranian nuclear capability. The political coalition around the blockade frays but does not formally break. The operation achieves enough economic pressure on Tehran to produce some form of negotiated outcome that the Trump administration can characterize as a victory. The cost to American alliance relationships and American standing in international institutions are real but deemed acceptable given the strategic objective achieved. This is the trajectory the Trump administration is publicly committed to and privately hoping for. It requires Tehran to respond to economic pressure more quickly than the historical evidence of Iranian strategic patience would suggest is likely. The second trajectory is that the economic and political pressure on allied governments accumulates to the point where private communication to Washington from Tokyo, Seoul, New Delhi, and European capitals reaches a volume and a specificity that forces a modification of blockade enforcement. Not a formal end, not a public reversal, but a quiet narrowing of what is being enforced and what is being allowed to pass that enables energy flows to partially normalize while the political claim that the blockade is in force is maintained. This trajectory is the one that the economic evidence most strongly supports as the likely outcome if the blockade continues for more than a few additional weeks without producing the Iranian concessions that would justify its continuation in allied eyes. It is a trajectory that saves face for Washington publicly while registering privately as a significant victory for the coalition of governments that sustained their pressure long enough to produce results. China claims credit in the diplomatic conversations that matter. America maintains its narrative in the press releases that are forgotten within a week. The third trajectory is the most dangerous and the one that responsible analysis cannot ignore, even though it is the one that everyone most wants to avoid. It is the trajectory in which the combination of physical confrontation in the strait, mounting allied pressure, Iranian escalation, and the absence of an exit ramp that all parties can accept simultaneously produces an incident that forces escalation decisions neither government planned to make at this moment. The Strait of Hormuz is a physically confined, militarily saturated, politically charged environment in which the gap between an unintended incident and a deliberate act of war can close with terrifying speed. Every additional week of sustained confrontation in those waters is a week in which the probability of an incident that forces decisions compounds. Managing that probability downward requires communication, mutual restraint, and diplomatic channels that function under pressure. The current state of the relationships involved does not guarantee that all of those conditions are reliably in place. Here is what the world turning against Trump's Iran blockade actually tells us. Not about Trump, not about Iran, but about the nature of American power in the world as it currently exists. American military power remains without peer. No navy on earth can contest American control of a maritime choke point that the United States has committed its forces to control. That reality is unchanged and should not be minimized. But American military power has always operated in a political context that multiplied its effectiveness enormously. The willingness of allies to provide basing rights, logistical support, intelligence cooperation, diplomatic cover, and institutional legitimacy has been the force multiplier that made American military dominance a global strategic asset rather than simply a very expensive national capability. When that political context erodes, when allies calculate their distance rather than their solidarity, when international institutions provide vocabulary for opposition rather than frameworks for support, when the global South sees American military action as evidence confirming its existing skepticism rather than as reassurance of American commitment to order, the force multiplier goes into reverse. American military power remains real. Its political amplification diminishes. And a superpower whose military capability is real but whose political support is contracting is a superpower that is more powerful than anyone but less effective than it needs to be. Trump's Iran blockade is a test of whether American power in the 21st century can still operate the way it operated at the height of the post-Cold War era, with overwhelming military capability backed by a broad and largely willing coalition of allied governments providing the political scaffolding that turned capability into authority. The answer the world is currently providing to that test is not a clear no. American authority has not collapsed. The scaffolding has not fallen, but it is visibly under strain in ways that are new, and the governments applying that strain are not the ones that have always been skeptical of American leadership. They are the ones that have historically been its most reliable foundation. And that is the fact that should worry Washington more than any Iranian missile, more than any Chinese tanker, more than any vote in the United Nations General Assembly. When the foundation starts to ask questions, the structure above it is already changing whether anyone inside it can feel the movement or not. Subscribe immediately. Share this analysis right now with everyone who is trying to understand what is actually happening in the Gulf and why it matters far beyond the Gulf's borders. Hit the notification bell. The situation is developing faster than conventional media can track it, and the next development will reshape everything we have just mapped. We will be back the moment it breaks. Stay close. The world is watching, and what it is watching is history.